The following education session will be focusing on LGBTQ plus cultural competency within long-term care. We'll start by introducing the meaning behind the letters in the LGBTQ plus acronym and discuss the experiences of the LGBTQ plus community, and then we'll dive into how you can provide an LGBTQ plus inclusive and culturally competent environment within your long-term care facility. Before we begin though, I would love if you could watch the short video that we've included within the description of this video just to give a taste of why this conversation is so important. So that video provides a brief look into the experiences LGBTQ plus seniors might have when entering long-term care. Now, it can be easy to say that that doesn't happen here or that there's no LGBTQ plus seniors within your facility because you don't know of any, but just because you don't know of any, that doesn't mean that they don't exist. In fact, if we look at Statistics Canada, we can see that there are 28,922 seniors aged 65 plus living on PEI. Now, approximately 10% of the population identifies as LGBTQ+, which means that there are approximately 2,892 seniors living on PEI who identify as a member of the LGBTQ+ community. So, if we are going to provide care for the LGBTQ+ community, it's important to know who the LGBTQ+ community encompasses. The first step is knowing what the words listed here mean. So I'm going to dive right in and describe them as best as I can. So the first word we have is gender. So gender is a socially constructed identity category made up of cultural, behavioral, and psychological traits often attributed to people based on their sex assigned at birth. However, this isn't necessarily the case, and gender exists outside of the scope of sex assigned at birth for many. Gender identity refers to a person's internal, personal sense or experience of their gender. So it's how you perceive the gender that you identify as, basically. Gender expression, on the other hand, refers to how a person expresses or communicates their gender identity. This can be through behaviors, physical experience, etc. So if you look at the gender unicorn on the screen, you can see that the identity is kind of what's in your mind, whereas the expression is those green dots surrounding the unicorn to just show that it's how you show the world what your gender is. Now, sexual orientation is a little different, and this has nothing to do with your gender, but it relates to your sexual attraction or your non-attraction for some people to other people. Now, the final word I want to explain, just so if I mention the word throughout the presentation, you'll know what it means, is coming out. So this is the ongoing process of accepting and telling others about your sexuality or your gender identity. And many of these terms, it's important to note, do exist on a spectrum. So your gender is a spectrum of varying identities, and we all fall along the spectrum differently, so that's just an important thing to note. Now we'll move into some more identity-specific terms, and don't get hung up on making sure that you have these terms memorized. It's just important to go over them just so you know just the different ways that people might identify, and just so that we recognize that these identities do exist and that they are valued and important. So the first word I'll start with is lesbian. So this is a woman whose primary attraction is to other women. While the term gay, it's more of an umbrella term that is often used by the LGBTQ plus community in general, but more specifically, it can refer to men who are attracted to other men. Now, bisexuality is the attraction to two or more genders. Pansexual is the attraction to people regardless of their gender identity. Heterosexual refers to, for example, men attracted to women and women attracted to men, and this is often described as straight. Asexual is the lack of or a limited sexual attraction to anyone. And just like I said, lots of these things are on a spectrum. Lots of Lots of people who identify as asexual also, their identities exist on a spectrum of varying levels of sexual attraction. Now, two-spirit is a term used by some indigenous people to describe their sexual orientation or gender identity. Transgender is a term used to describe people whose gender identity does not match the sex they were assigned at birth. So, for example, if I was born and the doctors said that I was a female, and then I grew up and I realized that this assignment that the doctors gave me when I was born is wrong, and I feel more like a boy on the inside or a man or however I choose to identify, and then I would be transgender. Now, cisgender is basically the opposite of transgender, and it just means someone whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth. So, like I said, if I was born and the doctors assigned me female or a girl, and I grew up and I identified as a woman, then I would be cisgender. Non-binary is an umbrella term for gender identities outside of or in between the gender binary. Genderqueer is an umbrella term for gender identities that exist between, outside of, or beyond the gender binary. So some non-binary and genderqueer people will identify as transgender and some will not. It just depends from person to person. Now, intersex refers to people whose genes, genitals, gonads, hormones, or internal reproductive organs are not in line with the perceived sex binary. Now, some intersex people choose not to identify as LGBTQ+, while some do. It also depends on the person. Questioning. So questioning is pretty simple. It just is someone who's questioning their gender identity or sexual orientation. Now, the final word I want to point to is queer. So queer is a traditionally derogatory or offensive term used toward LGBTQ+ people. But many in the LGBTQ+ community have reclaimed this word to describe their identity and is often used as a shorthand to refer to the community as a whole. So it can be defined as an umbrella term which refers to those who don't identify as straight or cisgender. However, not all LGBTQ+ people are comfortable with its use, nor should it be used to describe someone without them telling you that's the word they want to be described. And in general, if you are straight and cisgender, it's best if you don't use that word unless you're told specifically to be using that in the context. Also, because of history, because of the history of it being derogatory, if you're working in long-term care, it's likely that this won't be a word that's used because it might still be seen as offensive to many residents. So before we move on, I want to recognize that these identity terms are crucial, but they're also meaningless. So they're crucial because identity is about belonging. It is important that we respect people's desire to belong and identify them in the way they want to be identified. However, these terms are also relatively meaningless, not because they don't mean something to those who identify with these terms, but because these terms are so personal. They have a different meaning for each individual person. Knowing a person's identity won't tell you all that much about them unless you also know the meaning they attribute to that identity. Despite that, it's still important to respect people's identities because they do carry meaning and a sense of belonging for people. It's important to meet people exactly where they're at and support them in their identity in that moment. Okay. So now that we've gone over these terms, I want to move into minority stress. So despite progress that has been made in creating a more accepting world, we still do live in a world where there is often discrimination or mistreatment towards minority groups such as the LGBTQ+ community. And it's not only just individual acts and individual people, but our systems and our institutions are also designed in favor of cisgender and straight individuals and don't necessarily recognize the needs of the LGBTQ+ community. As a result, LGBTQ+ people are exposed to two forms of stressors. So there's internal stressors and external stressors. External stressors are those that come from outside of the individual. So things like discrimination, rejection, institutional oppression, physical harm, any of those things um, that come from outside the person, and it makes it harder for them to access resources or makes them fearful for their safety. Now, internal stressors, the second form of stressor, come from within the individual, but they're often a result of these external stressors. So these are things such as fear of having someone find out your identity, fear of experiencing discrimination, feeling like you have to hide your identity, those different things that are inside of you. So these stressors accumulate together and cause high stress responses and place LGBTQ plus individuals at a disadvantage in comparison to non-LGBTQ plus folks. They make it more difficult to access resources, not only for fear of exposure to more stressors, but also because these resources aren't designed for LGBTQ plus people. They don't have them in mind. These stressors accrue over time and contribute negatively to a person's overall physical and mental well-being, which results in more negative physical and mental health outcomes than the non-LGBTQ plus population. So, on my next slide, I am going to talk about how these internal and external stressors accumulate over time and contribute negatively to the physical and mental well-being, and just how this plays out in terms of the lives of LGBTQ plus folks as they get older. So, unfortunately, there's still minimal research into the life experiences of LGBTQ plus seniors, but I've taken a little bit of this research and present it to you today. So, nearly 40% of LGBTQ plus older adults have contemplated suicide at some point in their lives, with a high of 71% in transgender older adults. 59% of LGBTQ plus older adults feel they lack companionship, 53% feel isolated from others, and 53% feel left out. 82% of LGBTQ plus older adults have been victimized at least once because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And LGBTQ plus seniors are often more reliant on close friends and are 4 times more likely to rely on a friend as their caregiver. And this is because often LGBTQ plus seniors have faced rejection from their biological family, so they have chosen families who might not be biologically related to them, but still have the same value in their life as a family would for someone else. So why is this important? Well, because of these disparities, LGBTQ plus seniors often enter long-term care earlier than other seniors, which means that there are LGBTQ plus seniors living within these facilities, and they do deserve support and to feel included and safe within the facility after a lifetime of experiencing minority stress. So to review, LGBTQ plus seniors face numerous disparities or disadvantages due to discrimination and mistreatment, which have a negative adverse effect on their overall well-being. And because of these disparities, LGBTQ plus seniors enter long-term care earlier. So I have a few quotes to share. So, I am afraid of going into a care home, the bullying or the looks. It's easier to just go back into the closet than deal with that. My lesbian friend, whose given name is Hazel, has gone by the name Rusty her entire life. The staff in the skilled nursing facility insist on calling her Hazel. Mentally, she is very astute, but it is rare that other residents or staff interact or make conversation with her. I feel that she has been excluded or isolated often. My friend has been transferred from place to place several times. So, now that we've taken a look at these disparities and can see that LGBTQ plus individuals face discrimination and other stressors in their daily lives, how can we work to create an inclusive, supportive environment in our facilities? So, what does an inclusive environment look like, and how do you know you're providing an inclusive environment? Well, there are a few important things to keep in mind when we are trying to create an inclusive environment. First of all, treating all residents the same is not the same thing as inclusion. When we treat everyone the same, there is usually a norm or a standard we base that treatment off of. And with that, we unintentionally fail to recognize the experiences of others, which might cause them harm even if it's unintentional. So, a lack of intention to do harm does not mean that you aren't doing harm. By failing to recognize the various experiences of people, you are failing to recognize these people as people and failing to meet their unique needs. And because of a history of disparities and discrimination, many LGBTQ plus people assume a person or space is unsafe unless otherwise stated, which is why these efforts to be more inclusive are so important. So, what does an inclusive environment look like? Well, there are two ways I like to explain what an inclusive environment looks like. This is the perceive or feel framework. So, first is based off what you're able to perceive of a space. So, the physical space is what itself, as well as the actions of those in the space. So, for example, an individual might be able to see that the space is inclusive if there are LGBTQ plus positive symbols present and if the staff are actively working to be inclusive with their language, such as asking about a partner rather than a husband or wife, and just being supportive and inclusive in their everyday actions, which I'm going to go into further detail on in a few moments. So the second is based on feeling. So inclusive spaces must provide a feeling of safety and affirmation as a result of the efforts and actions that are perceived. So, for example, if staff are genuine in their efforts to increase inclusivity and they don't allow for forms of discrimination or mistreatment to occur. Now, in the next few slides, I will be outlining several ways you can ensure that residents will be able to perceive and feel that your facility is an inclusive environment. So, there are several things that you can do to help create a positive and inclusive space for your LGBTQ plus residents. Now, first and foremost, it's important to check yourself for assumptions and attitudes. If you have prejudice toward or believe stereotypes about a particular group, think about why and try to counter these beliefs. For most of us, our first thought is often one of prejudice or a stereotype. And that's okay, it's common in all of us, but what's important is how we respond to these thoughts. They might be our first thought, but our second thought should be working to counter them. The next thing is you can create a more inclusive environment by using inclusive language. Now, one way to do this is to use gender-neutral language. So, for example, when you're asking about the personal life of a resident, you can ask them if they have a partner rather than a husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend or however you'd usually ask it. This removes the assumption that they're married or in a heterosexual relationship, and it opens up space for them to share about their relationship if they do have one and it's not a stereotypically heterosexual relationship. You can also use inclusive language by referring to residents how they would like to be referred to. So, for example, if they go by a different name than their legal name, use the name they prefer to be called by. That just shows that you respect them and their autonomy and who they are as a human being. It's also really important to maintain confidentiality and privacy. If you know a resident identifies as LGBTQ+, don't share this information with other people. Just respect their privacy just as you would with any other situation, and show them that they can trust you. Finally, it's very important to continue to educate yourself. So don't stop at watching this presentation. There are plenty of resources online you can seek out, and it's important to keep learning. The more knowledge you have about LGBTQ plus seniors and the LGBTQ plus community as a whole, the more comfortable you will feel in providing inclusive care. So, if you're working to create a positive environment within your facility, there may be a time when a resident does come out to you and share they are a member of the LGBTQ plus community, whatever that identity might be for them. If they do so, it's really important to react positively. Don't react with shock or anything. Thank them for sharing with you and be supportive towards them. It can also help to find out who else knows, especially in terms of family members or other staff, so that you can maintain their privacy and their confidentiality as best as you can. If you don't maintain this privacy, you're not providing a safe space for them. Part of building a safe space is recognizing that it's the individual's choice to share their identity, and only they should be the ones to do so. Finally, you can check in to see if there is anything else you can do to make them feel more comfortable, to make your space more inclusive, and to ensure that living in this facility is a positive experience for them. This will not only ensure that you're able to make changes in order to make your space more inclusive, but it shows that you genuinely care about the resident and their experience living in the facility. One of the most common questions I get asked when I talk about creating more inclusive long-term care facilities is what to do if another resident is being offensive or discriminatory towards an LGBTQ plus resident, or if they just make a homophobic or inappropriate comment more generally. So if a resident does happen to do this, there's a few important things to keep in mind. First, it's important to know your policies and procedures. What policies do you already have in place to protect someone from discrimination? Alongside these policies, it can be helpful to think about how you respond in other similar situations. So, for example, how would you respond if a resident was being racist towards another resident? What would you do? Would you allow this behavior to happen, or would you stop it? Secondly, it's important to take time to understand how the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms works. So, some residents might have religious beliefs that mean they don't support or approve of the LGBTQ plus community. Now, according to the Charter, they do have the right to these beliefs. However, the Charter also protects sexuality and gender, so religious freedom cannot infringe upon the rights of another individual. And this includes the right to identify with the LGBTQ plus community and be safe in doing so. Simply put, it's against the Charter to discriminate. So whether or not there are clear policies in place, discriminatory behavior is unacceptable. On top of the Charter, you also have a Residents' Bill of Rights that protects your residents from discrimination or mistreatment, which means you have the responsibility to address this behavior if it does occur. So, finally, address the behavior. Because this behavior is unacceptable, it's important that you identify and you stop it. If you fail to do so, you're sending the message to not only the resident causing this behavior, but also all the other residents and the person who's experiencing this discrimination that this behavior is acceptable. So I know it can be hard or uncomfortable, challenging discriminatory behavior when it occurs, so I've created a little bit of a list to help you do so if it does take place. Obviously, this isn't going to go perfectly smoothly every time or follow this exact outline, but these steps are good to keep in mind when you are faced with this situation. So first of all, interrupt the behavior. Don't let it continue. There are many different ways to interrupt the behavior, such as saying, "Excuse me," or "That's not how we talk about people here," anything like that. It's just important to stop the behavior when it occurs. Alongside your interruption, it does help to label the behavior. So saying, "That's a stereotype," or "That's a generalization," etc. That's very helpful because it shows that you do recognize this behavior and you do know what is happening or taking place. And then thirdly, explain why the behavior is wrong. So you could say, "Because it's harmful to others," or "Because everyone deserves respect." So basically it can be as simple as saying, "Excuse me, that's a stereotype, and it's harmful because, or it's harmful and everyone deserves respect. It can be as simple as saying something as short as that. And then finally, you can also ask the person to change and be more respectful in future. Now, there may be times when the person isn't receptive to your interruption or your suggestion to change, and that's okay. The challenging the behavior isn't so much about the person who is exhibiting the behavior so much as it is about showing the rest of the residents in your facility, or just the facility as a whole, that this behavior is unacceptable and that everyone is accepted and it is a safe space and they will be protected from negative behaviors or discrimination if it does take place. So, to review all that before we move into the next section, it is important that we are intentional about the positive spaces we are creating. It has to be an active effort rather than a passive one. So this includes challenging hurtful or harmful behavior to send the message that the space you are building is an inclusive one. So we need to address and identify discriminatory behavior when it does take place. So we're going to move into, next we're going to move into talking about trans inclusion. So for trans residents in particular, there are a few other things we can do to make the facility more inclusive. So as we know, the LGBTQ+ community is made up of many different groups, and each of these groups have differing needs, so it's important to highlight the various ways we can be inclusive in order to reach more people. So for trans inclusion, it is important that we use the residents' terms for how they identify themselves. Trans is an umbrella category, so not every person will identify specifically as trans, though of course some will. Some might identify as non-binary or genderqueer, and others might not use a label at all. If a resident identifies with one of these terms, it is important to be supportive towards them and to use the term to describe their gender identity that they want you to use and that they feel comfortable being used. In general, it is important to know the gender identity of all of your residents so that you can be affirming and respectful. So, alongside this, it's important to use the correct gender pronouns when describing someone. To ensure this happens, sometimes you do have to ask and explain what you mean by pronouns, and we'll go into this in more details shortly. In terms of language, it's also important to echo the terms a resident uses to describe their body. Because trans folks were assigned a different gender or sex at birth than their gender identity, some trans folks may have a complicated or difficult relationship with their body, although, of course, it's important to recognize that some may not. As a result, they may describe their body differently than you would before knowing them. For example, a trans man who has not had a mastectomy may prefer to use the word chest as opposed to breasts when describing his body. It is important to respect these preferences and follow suit. Just like I explained earlier, it's also important not to act shocked or surprised when you are told or find out that a person is trans. Instead, be positive and affirming in your response. If you find out inadvertently while providing personal care, base your response on how the resident responds. It's really a case-by-case situation. If they want to have a conversation about it, be supportive and affirming. If they seem awkward or embarrassed, don't discuss it beyond the information that you need to provide care, but still remain affirming and positive and show that you are supportive. So another quote here. I have realistic concerns that I will not be treated as I would like when I am dependent on others. I worry that people will attempt to force me into being the wrong gender. So a few more details on trans inclusion within a facility. There are some important things to keep in mind. First of all, when you are providing care and you need to ask personal questions, preface these questions with the reason why you're asking. Many trans folks have had recurring experiences of being asked invasive or inappropriate questions throughout their life about their bodies or their life in general. which can make them wary towards questions. But if you explain why you are asking, it can help alleviate some of this wariness. It's also important to ask the right questions. We sometimes ask questions, but we're actually looking for the answer to a different question. For example, you might ask someone, "Do you have children?" when what you're hoping to find out is whether or not they have family or significant relationships in their life or people who care for them. Before asking questions, think about what it is you want to know and adjust your question accordingly. Also, when you're providing care, always explain to the resident what you're doing and ask them permission to do so. This maintains their bodily autonomy and helps show that you are trying to respect that autonomy, because all residents do deserve autonomy over their bodies, regardless of whether or not they need help with receiving care. Finally, only ask questions that you need to provide personal care. Like I said before, many trans folks are asked invasive and personal questions frequently. It is not their job to educate you. You can ask questions to get to know them as a person, as you would with any other resident, but when it comes to their bodies and their experiences as a trans person, ensure your questions are relevant to their care rather than a result of your curiosity or nosiness. So another quote, "I have had an overwhelmingly positive experience with my gender transition so far, but I would say that my primary concern about the future is with access to healthcare and potential discrimination as a senior transgender person, especially if the need arises for emergency or long-term care." Now, like I said, we're going back to pronouns to talk about these for a little bit. So we use pronouns every single day without even thinking about it, but they are very important. They're a very important part of creating an inclusive and supportive environment. Pronouns are used to replace nouns in a sentence, and they often reference the gender of the person they are replacing. So pronouns are words like he, him, she, her, they, them, and there are many more. We should always make sure to use the correct gender pronouns to refer to people in order to show respect. So this may come up most frequently with trans residents, but it's valuable to make this a habit. Asking people their pronouns instead of assuming them based on how the person looks. For example, I might say, "Hi, my name is Jen. I go by she, her pronouns. How should I refer to you?" Something as simple as that can make a big difference. So, some people do prefer gender-neutral pronouns, which are pronouns that do not associate the individual you're referring to with a gender. These pronouns are often used by non-binary or genderqueer individuals, but they can also be used by anyone. And remember that, the important thing is that if someone wants you to use gender-neutral pronouns to describe them, then you should use them. The most common one you'll run into is they, them. You might think this is plural, but we actually use it to describe singular people all the time. So, for example, I could say, "They forgot their keys, but they'll likely stop by to pick them up later." And you know this is just one person who forgot their keys, and you haven't identified their gender, but you still understand it's singular. If you do end up making a mistake with someone's pronouns, apologize, correct yourself, move forward. Don't dwell on it or make too big of a deal out of it. We all make mistakes, and it's worse to focus on it than it is to move on and just correct yourself and use the proper pronouns in the future. So, to review, it's incredibly important to use the language a resident wants you to use, to ask your questions with intention and care, and to respect gender identity and pronouns. Now, these might seem like basic things, but they will make a huge difference. So before we close off, I want to talk about putting our learnings into practice. So I have a few case scenarios that we can go over and discuss. So the first case scenario, let's say during lunch, a resident makes a homophobic comment towards another resident. So how would you respond? Now, remember that LGBTQ plus residents have the right to respect and fair treatment in your space. And remember that if you don't say something, you are sending the message that this behavior is okay. So it's really important that you interrupt the behavior and explain why it's wrong, and encourage the person who exhibited this behavior to change it in the future. Follow the policies and procedures in place at your facility for discrimination. These are all relatively simple things that you can do to respond to this situation. Now let's say one of the residents, Susie, has a close friend, Janet, who visits several times a week. Susie has dementia. One day, while Janet is visiting, Susie inadvertently shares that Janet is actually her partner. So how do you respond? So it's important to react in a positive manner. Ensure Susie and Janet both know that this is a safe and inclusive space. Tell them that you respect their privacy and that you'll maintain their confidentiality. Some other things you can do is ask who else knows so you can maintain this privacy, and ask if there's anything else you can do to make them both feel more comfortable. Okay. When Ray's biological family members bring Ray to move into the facility, Ray is dressed in men's clothing. After the family leaves, Ray insists on changing into something more feminine. How do you respond? So Ray's comfort is priority. If Ray wants to dress more femininely, it is causing no harm to let Ray do so. So basically, at the end of the day, ensure Ray's desires and needs are priority. It's a fairly simple response to the situation, but it's an important one. Rocky's intake forms state that her legal name is Jennifer. However, whenever anyone calls her Jennifer, she refuses to respond. How do you respond? So, no matter what the intake form says, it's important to call residents by the name they want to be called. Most of us know someone or have a friend who only gets called by a nickname, and we're usually pretty okay with that. So this is the same situation. Respect the person and what they want to be called. When helping provide personal care for a resident, you notice that their bodily characteristics don't match your preconceptions of what the body of someone with their gender identity should look like. How do you respond? So just like we discussed, try not to act shocked and only ask questions related to their personal care if you need to know, and explain why you need to know if you do need to ask questions. A new resident is moving into the facility. They tell you that they do not identify as a man or a woman. Instead, they identify as non-binary and they use they/them pronouns. They are concerned about gender-segregated rooms and washrooms. So how do you respond? So you can reassure the resident that you'll offer an inclusive and supportive space, and you can share with them the efforts you're currently making to do so. It's important to ensure the resident is placed in a room they feel comfortable and supported in, and ensure they have access to an all-gender washroom in public areas. So in this scenario, it might be helpful to talk with them one-on-one and just discuss what their hopes are for moving into the facility, and just the setup that they would be interested in. So now that we've gone over the scenarios, we have our final brief review of the most important takeaways from this presentation. So first, inclusion requires intention. We need to actively work to create inclusive spaces. Second, we need to make sure our efforts for inclusion are reflected in the physical environment around us through our words and actions. These are really important and valuable things to take away, and they're the basis of everything that I talked about in this presentation. So thank you for listening.